On the night they meant to strip him of his crown, the Hollow King knelt before the conclave with his scarred hand bared on the cold stone, and not one lord in the Hollow Hall believed it would ever close. 80 hollow moons he had carried that wound, and 80 hollow moons the watching packs had counted them like debts owed. They called him broken in private rooms and weak in whispers grown too loud to stay private at all. The woman they had sent to heal him stood at his shoulder in plain servant's wool, and the lords looked at her the way they looked at the wound itself, as something to be endured until it finally failed. Lord Osric rose from the council bench with the patience of a man who had waited 80 years for this exact hour, and he opened his mouth to say the word that would end it. What happened next, no one in that hall yet had the language for. It was the 812th winter of the Concord, the long peace the Pax had sworn after the Iron Wars, and in the village of Hareth, Senna Bray knelt in frozen mud washing bandages that were not hers to wash. She was 25 years old and had been ash blood for 9 of them, ever since the morning the Grey Mantle Guard had dragged her parents from their cottage and burned the healer's house to its foundation stones, while the village watched and said nothing. Her mother and father had been summoned to the keep once, long before Senna was born to remember it firsthand, and had failed to mend something the keep never spoke of. They came home with their hands shaking and never spoke of it either. And 9 years ago, the silence had finally cost them their lives on a charge no one would name aloud. Ashblood was the word the village used now, a healer's line burned down to nothing, fit only for the lowest labor and the coldest water. Senna's hands had gone numb an hour ago. She kept washing anyway, because the alternative was to stop and feel the cold all the way through, and feeling things all the way through was a luxury Ashblood did not get to keep. Her brother Tam was 9, all elbows in a gap where his front tooth had not yet grown back, and he was the only reason she had not simply walked into the river the winter their parents died. He waited for her most evenings at the edge of the wash-yard, pretending he was not waiting, and she pretended she did not see him do it. That arrangement had held for 9 years. It was the only roof either of them trusted. She had taught him his letters herself, by firelight, because the village school would not take an Ashblood child, and she had promised him once, in a moment of grief, she rarely allowed herself, that whatever else the world took from their family, it would not take the two of them from each other. The summons came on a gray morning in the second week of frost, carried by a Grey Mantle rider who did not dismount to deliver it. Every healer's line in the valley, however reduced, owed the keep a tribute hand when one was called for, and one was called for now. Senna read the parchment twice, her stomach folding in on itself, because the keep had not asked for a tribute hand in 9 years, not since the year her parents went. She understood why before she finished reading the second line. The king's hand. The wound that would not close. Another healer sent up the frozen road to fail where every healer before her had failed, and the village of Hareth would watch her go the way it had watched her parents go, with eyes that had already decided how the story ended. Tam clung to her wrist at the gate, his knuckles white. "Take me with you," he said, not as a question. "The keep does not want children underfoot," Senna told him, which was true, and also not the reason her chest had gone tight at the thought of leaving him behind in a village that called her family cursed. A widow named Old Anit, who had fed them broth more nights than either of them could count, swore on her own hearth that Tam would not want for a bed or a meal. Senna believed her enough to leave. She did not believe the keep enough to stop looking back at the gate until the road bent and took the village out of sight. The frozen road north took the better part of a day, and Senna spent most of it counting the small comforts she would not have for however long the keep kept her. The smell of Old Anit's wood smoke, the particular creak of the floorboard outside her own narrow bed, Tam's habit of falling asleep mid-sentence with his head against her shoulder. The hedgerows along the road wore a crust of ice that did not melt even at midday, and twice she passed carts coming the other way, their drivers crossing themselves at the sight of a healer's satchel and looking quickly away, as though Ashblood might be catching if she came near enough. She kept her chin level and her eyes on the frozen ruts ahead, and did not give either driver the satisfaction of flinching, a habit 9 years deep enough by now that it cost her almost nothing to keep. Greymantle Keep rose out of the winter haze like something the cold itself had built. Gray stone stacked 3 centuries deep, its towers blunt and unornamented, built for war and never softened since. Senna had heard of it her whole life and seen it only twice, both times from the valley road, both times small and far away. Up close, it swallowed the sky. She was brought through a side gate by a guard who did not speak to her, and delivered to a narrow stone chamber off the kitchens that smelled of tallow and old smoke, where an older healer named Joss looked her over with the flat assessment of a man counting losses in advance. "You will see him tonight," Joss said. "Mind you do not touch the hand without leave. The last two who forgot that rule are not healing anyone anymore." Senna asked what happened to them. Joss did not answer, which was answer enough. The hollow hall, when she was led into it that evening, was vast and dim and packed with bodies she had not expected. Lords and their seconds from packs whose banners she did not know, all of them turned toward a dais at the far end where a man sat with one hand resting bare on the stone arm of his chair. Even from the doorway she felt the room organize itself around him, the way a held breath organizes a chest. Conversation thinned as she crossed the floor. Somewhere behind her a voice murmured Ashblood, low enough to seem accidental and pitched precisely loud enough to be heard. She did not look for the speaker. She kept her eyes on the dais, because the dais was where her work was, and work was the only ground Ashblood ever got to stand on without apology. The king did not rise when she reached him. Up close his eyes were a pale gray she had no ready word for, and the hand he laid out for her inspection looked less like a wound and more like a verdict. The skin around it scarred white and red in concentric rings that had clearly never been allowed to finish closing. A thin, dark line ran beneath the surface near the base of his thumb, visible only because she was close enough and trained enough to know what she was looking at. Iron, she thought. Not natural iron either. "You are smaller than the last one," the king said. His voice was low and even, with no curiosity in it that she could find. "I am told that means nothing." "It means nothing," she agreed, and knelt to look at his hand properly, because looking at the wound was easier than looking at him. Lord Osric watched the examination from the front bench. An old man with a hooked nose and pale, watery eyes, and a heavy iron ring worn on a cord at his throat instead of a finger, as though the metal itself could not be trusted closer to his skin than that. He said nothing while Senna worked, which felt worse than if he had. When she finally rose and stepped back, he was the one who spoke first, to the hall rather than to her. "Another Ashblood sent to fail where her line has always failed," he said, loud enough to carry to the rafters. "Perhaps the Concord should stop wasting healers on a wound the gods themselves have judged." No one in the hall disagreed with him. Senna kept her spine straight and her hands folded and did not give them the satisfaction of watching her flinch, though something in her chest had gone very small and very cold. The same smallness she remembered from the morning the guard came for her parents. The king's eyes moved to her once, briefly, before Osric had even finished speaking. It was not a long look. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds, and the room had gone quiet enough that she felt it land, felt the small, specific weight of being seen by someone whose attention she had not earned and could not afford. For reasons she did not examine, she found she could not look away from his bare, scarred hand resting on the stone, as though some part of her had already decided that hand was hers to mind. She was given a cot in the healer's wing that night, narrow and cold, and she lay awake long past the hour the candles guttered, turning over the shape of the iron beneath the king's skin and the particular silence of a room that had decided, before she ever opened her mouth. Exactly how this would end. She did not yet know the hall had read the same verdict before, over other names and other hands. You may already suspect this telling will end differently. She only knew, standing cold beside the dais, that the room had judged her before she had spoken a single word, and judgment was a language 9 years had taught her to answer with silence. Joss put her to work the following morning sorting the healer's stores, a slow and deliberate humiliation disguised as instruction, since every healer who had come before her had begun the same way, and most had ended there too, never once permitted near the king's hand again after the first inspection. Senna did not complain. She catalogued bandages and dried roots, and learned the shape of the wing instead. The cold corridor that led to the hearth room where the king kept his private hours, the old gray wolf that lay near that hearth most days, vast and silver-coated and far larger than any wolf had any business being, with one notched ear and eyes the color of banked amber. The wolf's name, a kitchen girl told her, was Fen, old enough that none of the current guard remembered him as a pup, and he belonged to no one in particular anymore, having outlived the master who first claimed him. Fen lifted his head when Senna passed the hearth-room door on her third morning, studied her for a long moment with those amber eyes, and then rose unhurried and came to stand at her side, pressing his great head briefly against her hip before settling at her feet as though the matter had been decided somewhere she had not been consulted. Joss, watching from the doorway, went very still. "That dog has not chosen a person's company in 4 years," he said. Senna did not know what to do with the information, so she crouched and rested her bare hand against the wolf's flank instead, and felt the old animal's heartbeat slow and steady under her palm, calmer than her own. Lady Vesna found her there an hour later, trailing 2 attendants and a cold green gown that made the stone hall look warmer by contrast. She looked at Senna the way she might look at something tracked in on a boot. "So this is the new one," she said to no one in particular. "Tell me, does ash blood wash off, or does the village simply never let you try?" Senna had spent 9 years learning when silence cost less than an answer. This was one of those times. She said nothing, and Vesna's mouth thinned with the particular disappointment of someone who had wanted a wound to press and found none offered, and she swept on toward the hall without waiting for one. The kitchen girl who had named Fen for her, a thin, quick-eyed girl called Pell, found Senna scrubbing pots that same afternoon, and seemed to have decided, in the way kitchen girls sometimes did, that a healer with nothing left to lose was safer to talk to than anyone with rank to protect. "They call him the king who would not heal behind his back," Pell said, low, glancing at the door. Some of the older guard remember him before, when he laughed at table and the hall did not go quiet when he walked into it. 80 years is a long time to watch a man go silent a little more every winter. "What happened to him?" Senna asked, careful to keep her voice as low as Pell's. Pell only shook her head. "No one left alive says it plain," she said. "Lord Osric tells it as treachery from a rival pack, long since punished. The old guard say the punishing never seemed to land on anyone we could name." Then she caught herself, as though she had already said more than the kitchens were safe to say, and went back to her work without finishing the thought, leaving Senna with one more piece of a puzzle she had not yet realized she was assembling. That evening, Joran, the king's second, came to fetch her for the night inspection instead of Joss, a broad, quiet man with a scar through one eyebrow who watched her with an assessing patience that felt entirely different from Osric's contempt. He walked a half-pace behind her down the corridor, close enough to be useful if the stone floor turned to ice, and far enough to leave her room to breathe, a small courtesy none of the other guards had bothered with. He did not speak until they reached the hearth-room door. "The king does not sleep well," he said. "If you ask him about it, he will lie to you. I am only telling you so you know the lie when you hear it." The hearth-room was smaller than the hall and warmer, lit by a single fire and 2 candles, and the king sat near the flame with his bandaged hand resting on his knee, unwrapping it himself with the clumsy economy of a man long practiced at managing his own wounds alone. He did not look up when she entered. "You came back," he said. "The others stopped after the first week." "I am not the others," Senna said, and knelt to take the bandage from his hand before he finished the job badly. The wound looked worse by firelight, the iron thread beneath the skin catching the flame in a way that made her stomach turn. She worked in silence for a long while, cleaning the edges, testing what little give the scar tissue allowed, aware the entire time of how close her fingers came to his without crossing the rule Joss had given her. "Mind you, do not touch the hand without leave." She was careful. She was also, despite herself, aware of his stillness in a way that had nothing to do with the wound. The controlled quality of a man holding very still on purpose. The warmth coming off him that the cold room could not account for. "What put the iron in your hand?" she asked, before she could decide whether asking was wise. His jaw tightened. "A man I trusted," he said, and offered nothing more. The kind of answer that closed a door rather than open one. She let it lie. When she finished and rose to leave, he caught her wrist. Not hard, barely a pressure at all, and for one suspended moment neither of them moved. His gray eyes held hers with an intensity that had nothing courteous in it and nothing cruel either. Something unnamed sitting underneath both. Her pulse climbed in her throat, loud enough that she was certain he could hear it in the quiet room. Then he released her, as abruptly as he had taken hold, and looked away into the fire. "That is all?" he said, to the flames rather than to her. And Senna left before either of them had to explain what had just happened, her wrist still warm where his hand had been, a warmth that had no business outlasting a touch that brief. She did not sleep well either that night. The pattern held for 9 days. Joss assigned her stores in the mornings. Joren fetched her for the hearth room each evening, and each evening the king said little and watched more, and each evening some small, deniable thing happened that Senna told herself meant nothing. He ordered a guard who shoved her aside in the corridor reassigned to the kennels by morning, with no explanation given beyond a flat order issued at the man's captain. He asked once whether the healer's wing kept her warm enough at night, a question phrased as duty and delivered with an attention duty did not usually require. He never touched her again after that first night, though she began to notice the careful distance he kept as its own kind of evidence, the distance of a man minding himself rather than a man indifferent. On the 7th evening she arrived to find him already standing, restless in a way she had not seen from him before, his bandaged hand flexing at his side, as though the stillness of the chair had grown unbearable. He watched her cross the room and did not pretend otherwise. "I told Joren I did not need a healer tonight," he said. "I asked for you anyway. There is a difference, and I am aware of it." Senna's pulse climbed at the admission, plain and unguarded in a way none of his deniable kindnesses had been. "Why?" she asked, because some part of her needed to hear him say it, even knowing the room would not let him say it twice. He was quiet long enough that she thought he would not answer at all. "Because the hearth room is too quiet when you are not in it," he said finally, low, the words costing him visibly more than the sentence's length should have. "That is not duty. I do not pretend it is." The fire cracked between them, and neither of them moved to fill the silence that followed. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, fast and unhelpful, and beneath it some quieter pulse that seemed to answer to his nearness rather than her own fear. A warmth low in her chest that had nothing to do with the hearth at her back. Then his jaw tightened, the old control reasserting itself by visible effort, and he looked away into the flames. "Forget I said it," he said. "It changes nothing." It already has, she thought, though she did not say it aloud, and unwrapped his bandaged hand in silence because silence was the only safe thing either of them had left to offer the other that night. On the 10th night, the wound bled. It happened without warning. A sudden seizing in his jaw and shoulders that dropped him half out of his chair. His bandaged hand clutched against his chest as the scar tissue split along its old lines, and the dark iron beneath it surfaced bright and sharp under the skin like a blade working its way out from the inside. Joran shouted for the guard. The guard, when they came, stood in the doorway and did nothing, because the law of the keep held that none but a sworn physician could touch the king's wound without the conclave's leave, and the only sworn physician in the keep was 3 days gone on the winter road and would not return before morning. Senna did not wait for leave. She crossed the room and took his bleeding hand in both of hers, pressing her palms flat over the broken scar, and the iron beneath the skin burned cold against her fingers like something alive and furious at being touched. The king's breath came ragged through his teeth. "Stop," he managed. "You cannot. The law." And she held on anyway, because some things mattered more than a law built to keep her safe from a punishment she had already decided to risk. "I am not asking permission," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, and bent her whole attention to the wound the way her mother had once taught her before the guard came for them both, pouring calm into her hands because that was the only medicine she had that the keep had not catalogued and confiscated. The seizing slowed, the bleeding eased, and under her palms, faint as a held breath, she felt the scar tissue at the wound's edge soften, the angriest of the old white ridges easing by some fraction too small to measure and too real to imagine. The king's hand turned beneath hers, not pulling away, his fingers closing loosely around her own as the worst of it passed, and he looked at her with an expression she had no name for yet. Something cracked open, where a moment ago there had been only iron and control. Neither of them said anything. The fire popped once in the silence, and neither of them looked away from it. She was aware of every point where they touched in a way that had nothing to do with healing anymore, his pulse beating fast and unsteady beneath her fingers, where she still held his wrist, the warmth of him against the cold stone floor beneath her knees, the low wood smoke and leather scent of him, this close, that she had not let herself notice before. Her own breath came shallow and quick, and she did not trust herself to stand yet, not with her hands still learning the shape of him under hers. If you have ever held something together with your bare hands while everyone around you said it could not be done, you already know the particular ache of that kind of holding. It does not ask permission either. The law had been broken now, and the keep did not forgive a broken law quietly. By morning, the whole wing knew. Joss found her in the stores at dawn, his face grim, and told her she had been summoned before the conclave for judgment. The same hall, the same dais, a different reckoning. Osric arrived at the hearing already smiling, the particular smile of a man who has been handed exactly the weapon he wanted. She touched the king's wound against the law of this concord, he announced to the gathered lords, and look, the wound bled worse for it. Is this not proof the ash bloodline carries the same failure it has always carried, dressed up this time as defiance? It bled because it was already failing before she touched it, Joran said from the floor below the dais, his voice flat and certain. I was in the room. I watched it happen. Osric waved the objection away with the ease of a man who had won every argument in that hall for decades. The penalty for unlawful contact with the king's hand is exile from the Concord's protection, he said, looking directly at Senna for the first time. Effective at dawn tomorrow. Take the brother with her, if there is a brother. Ash blood does not deserve the comfort of being separated kindly. The mention of Tam went through her like cold water. She had told no one his name. Someone in this hall had gone looking, and the only person with reason to look was the man now smiling at her from the council bench. The king's hand, still raw and freshly bound, closed into a fist on the arm of his chair, the only sign he gave that the threat had landed anywhere at all. He said nothing in that hall to stop the sentence from being read. Senna understood, even as the floor seemed to drop away beneath her, that there was a difference between what a king wanted and what a king, bound by 80 years of his own council's law, was permitted to give. The sentence stood. 3 days, Osric said, savoring it, until the 80th hollow moon, when this whole sorry business will finally be settled one way or another. Let the Ashblood and her brother be gone from Greymantle lands by then, or let the law deal with both of them as it sees fit. Senna was escorted back to the healer's wing under guard, her chest hollow, her mind already racing toward Tam, toward old Annet's hearth, and whether 3 days was enough time to get him somewhere, Osric's reach did not extend. She did not yet know that the old healer's chamber she had been given held, tucked behind a loose stone her mother had once shown her in a different keep entirely, the one thing in Greymantle that might still save them both. She found it that same night, restless and searching for nothing in particular, her fingers tracing the same kind of seam her mother used to hide things behind in their old cottage. An old healer's habit passed down without explanation until the explanation was suddenly, urgently necessary. Behind the stone was a small oilskin packet, brittle with age, and inside it a single folded page in her mother's careful hand, dated 9 years and 1 month before the night the guard came. "I have found what holds the king's hand open," her mother had written. "It is not a sickness. It was placed there the night of his coronation by a man close enough to the throne to be trusted with the blade that did it, and I dare not write his name here, in case this page is found, before I can speak it aloud to someone who can act on it. I have told Joss only that I am close. I pray I live long enough to tell the conclave the rest." Senna read it 3 times with shaking hands. Her mother had not failed the king's wound at all. Her mother had found the truth of it, and someone had made very certain she never lived to say it. She sat back against the cold stone wall and let herself remember, for the first time in 9 years, the exact morning the guard came, the way her mother had pressed something small into her father's coat pocket before the door broke open, the way neither of them had fought when the guard took them, as though they had already known the price of the truth they carried and had decided, between them, that the price would be paid by the 2 of them and not by their children. She had spent 9 years believing her parents had simply failed the way the village said they had failed. She understood now that they had succeeded at something far more dangerous than healing, and had been silenced for it instead of honored. She did not sleep that night either, though for an entirely different reason than the nights before. She brought the page to Joran before dawn, because Joran was the only person in the keep she had reason to trust, and watched his face go through disbelief, and then something colder and more focused, as he read it twice over by candlelight. "This changes the charge," he said quietly. "If we can prove who placed the iron, the law that exiles you no longer matters. 3 days, though, is not long enough to prove a thing this old, not against a man who has had 80 years to bury it." "Then we make it not need 3 days," Senna said, and the plan that formed between them in the small hours before the hearth-room fire was reckless and thin, and the only one either of them had. The 80th hollow moon arrived with a hard, clear cold that made every breath visible across the packed floor of the hollow hall. Every bench was full. Word of the unlawful touching had traveled to packs Senna had never heard named, and among the visiting lords sat Alpha Doran of Ironcrest, broad and gray-bearded, a power whose word carried weight even Osric was careful around, come to watch the Concord's oldest open wound finally be settled one way or the other. Doran had arrived 2 days before the moon and asked, within Senna's hearing, why a tribute healer was being exiled for the crime of saving a king's life. Joss had given him no answer beyond a careful shrug, the kind of shrug a man gives when he has survived 80 years at Greymantle by never answering questions like that one. Senna had watched Doran's heavy brow draw down at the shrug and file the unanswered question away, and had hoped, without much real hope, that it would matter when the hour came. The king was led to the dais in chains of plain forged silver, a ceremonial restraint reserved for judgment days, heavier than they looked, and bright enough to burn where they crossed his bare wrists. Senna was brought to stand below the dais beside Joren, Tam's small cold hand gripped tight in her free one, because old Annet's cottage had been searched at first light, and there had been nowhere left to hide him that Osric's men had not already thought to look. Osric rose to address the hall with the unhurried satisfaction of a man closing a very old account. 80 hollow moons ago I stood in this hall and watched our king crowned, he said. I have stood in it every hollow moon since, watching that crowning's wound refuse to close, and I have grieved it as deeply as any man here. Tonight, we end the grieving. The girl broke this Concord's law, and the wound bled worse for her touching, proof enough of what her blood is worth. Let her exile be carried out before this assembly, and let the king's hand be examined one final time, that we may at last accept what 80 years has already told us. He crossed the floor himself, and took the king's bandaged hand in his own, unwrapping it before the gathered lords with theatrical care, and beneath the linen the wound was as raw and unhealed as it had ever been, the iron thread dark beneath the skin, catching the torchlight. A murmur ran the length of the hall. Even Doran's heavy brow drew down. There, Osric said, as I have always said, some wounds are not meant to close. It was a wound I gave him myself, Senna said, before fear could stop her mouth from moving, and the hall fell silent in a way it had not fallen silent for Osric. Then prove it healed before you exile yourself from the chance to, Osric said, smiling, certain of the silver chains and the law, and 80 years of unquestioned authority all working in his favor at once. Senna did not ask permission this time either. She crossed the floor with Tam's hand slipping from her own as Joran caught and held him back. And she knelt before the dais and took the king's wounded hand in both of hers in front of the entire conclave, the silver chains burning faint where they brushed her wrists, the iron beneath his skin cold and sharp and furious against her palms, exactly as it had been on the 10th night. Except this time, she did not hold back any part of what she had. She poured everything she had left into that hand, her mother's training and her own 9 years of swallowed grief, and the simple, undeniable fact that some part of her had decided, without ever once asking leave, that this man's healing mattered more to her than her own safety did. The iron resisted. Then, with a sound like a held breath finally released, it gave. The thread of cursed metal surfaced fully beneath the skin and broke, dissolving to nothing as the silver chains at the king's wrists snapped clean through with a crack that rang to the rafters. The binding that had held both the iron and the chains finally severed at its source. Senna felt the force of it pass through her own hands and up her arms like cold fire, and her knees gave beneath her, the room tilting sideways. The king caught her before she struck the stone, his freed hand closing around her own, and when she looked up at him, his gray eyes had gone bright, with something the whole hall could see now. Something 80 years of iron had been built specifically to keep buried. Mine, he said, low and rough and entirely without elaboration, the single word landing in the stunned quiet like the last stone of a wall finally falling. I should have said it 80 years ago. He rose to his full height with her hand still held in his, and the air in the hall changed with him, the weight of a power that had been suppressed for 80 hollow moons returning all at once, dropping the nearest guards briefly to one knee before they caught themselves. Somewhere beyond the great doors, a long howl rose and answered itself twice over, and a moment later, Fen pushed through the gathered ranks at the back of the hall, ears flat, amber eyes fixed on the dais, until he came to stand at Senna's other side, as though he had always known this was where the night would end. 80 lords had come to watch their king kneel for the last time. 80 lords rose to their feet instead, and one by one, beginning with Doran of Ironcrest, they knelt again. this time for an entirely different reason. Osric did not kneel. He backed toward the doors instead, his composure finally cracking, and it was Joran who caught his arm and turned him, and the page from Senna's mother that Joran laid open on the dais stone for the whole conclave to read. "The hand that wrote this has been silent 9 years," Joran said. "It will not be silent any longer." Osric's challenge to the throne, should he wish to dispute the charge by combat as Concord law allowed any accused lord, lasted less than a minute. The king, who had carried 80 years of stolen strength, needed only a fraction of it returned to put the old man on his back on the cold stone, pinned and beaten in dominance rather than blood. The law's own oldest remedy turned at last against the man who had broken it first. Osric was stripped of rank and ring before the hall had finished holding its breath, his iron signet cut from its cord and cast onto the stone beside him. Lady Vesna, who had stood close enough to his schemes to share in their fall, found her own standing quietly and permanently withdrawn before the night was through. Tam ran the moment Joran released him, crossing the hall floor at a child's reckless speed straight into Senna's side, and she folded her free arm around him without letting go of the king's hand, because she did not intend to let go of either of them again if she could help it. The 80 lords who remained kneeling watched in a silence that had finally turned to something like awe as the king lifted Senna's hand and pressed his mouth briefly to her knuckles before the whole assembly, an act that needed no further words attached to it. Some things, once seen plainly enough, do not require explaining twice. It took 3 more days for the keep to settle into its new shape, the iron law of 9 decades unwound thread by thread and replaced with something neither of them yet had a name for. On the 3rd evening, Senna found the king in the hearth room exactly where she had first found him, his bare hand resting on his knee in the firelight, except now the skin was smooth and whole, not a single ring of old scarring left to mark where 80 years of iron had lived. She crossed the room and sat beside him instead of kneeling, because there was no wound left to kneel for, and took the healed hand in hers simply to feel it, warm and ordinary, and entirely his own. He turned it over under her palm, watching her face rather than his own skin. "I do not know how to be looked at without that scar telling them what to expect first," he admitted, quiet enough that the words seemed to cost him something. Senna laced her fingers through his and did not answer right away, letting the fire and the silence hold the moment the way silence sometimes holds things better than speech can. "They will learn to look at you the way I do," she said finally. "Whole." He lifted her hand then, slow, and stopped just short of his mouth, his eyes asking a question his voice did not need to. She understood the pause for what it was, a man who had spent 80 years guarding every part of himself, finally choosing, deliberately and in no hurry at all, to let one part of himself be undefended in front of her. She did not look away, and after a long moment he closed the distance himself, his lips warm against her knuckles, unhurried, as though he had finally stopped counting the cost of wanting something. Outside the hearth-room window the winter held steady over Greymantle, and somewhere below, in the kennels, Fen lay curled at the foot of Tam's borrowed bed, having chosen, it seemed, a second person in as many weeks. The wound that had marked 80 years of one man's silence was gone from his hand at last, and in its place, plain and unremarkable as any healed thing, was simply his own bare skin, warm under hers and whole.